Hi, and welcome to the Deer IQ podcast, where smart hunting begins. I'm Adam Lewis, and we're starting a new series about land and food strategies. How do you best set up your land for success? In this episode, we're looking at 4 key questions any landowner should ask before they start planning, cutting, or making major moves on their land. And if you already have a managed property, these are also good things to think about to recalibrate before you continue moving forward with your current plan. I'm joined again by my friend Mark for this discussion, who is currently trying to figure out a land plan for his family property, which we discuss. Okay, so here are the top things to look for during this episode. What are the 4 questions to be asked in order, and why is answering them honestly so important? How can you figure the ceiling or buck potential for your particular hunting land? How is a vision different than goals? And why is this a key distinction I make? Why are these 4 questions critical to answer before you start cutting, planning, or setting a plan in place? And there's a lot more in there as usual, so let's get to the podcast and up your deer IQ. All right. Here we are, Mark, again. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. Getting into kind of interesting topic and just the beginnings of it, looking at land management and really where to start. So for people that are maybe they just bought a property, maybe they had a property for a long time, but they're looking at, okay, I want to do something to really improve it. Like, where do I start? And so this is for kind of those beginner type people or people that are, wanting to start the right way. Today, we're going to look at 4 questions I think that a landowner really should ask before they jump in to do something. And it'd be good for anybody, even if you have your property, you've been working on it for a while, or you've been hunting it for a long time, to also ask these questions. I don't think there's a bad time to ask these questions, but it's definitely for someone that's looking to start an improvement process, right? And so thanks for joining us again, because I know you kind of have a personal story with this too. We're going to kind of walk through this together. So I'll turn it over to you, Mark.
Yeah, man, I've been in the thick of this for the past month. It's not a new property. It's family property that, I think I'm like the 4th or 5th generation. But wasn't sure what was going to happen with it. It was kind of recently hedged back into, knowing that it'll be in the family. And it literally hasn't been touched. So now that I'll probably have some more control and my parents who now own it, talking with them about wanting to see it used more and developed more from some recreation, but certainly from a hunting, standpoint. I can say it's really intimidating. I mean, there's a lot of good information out there, but I think some of these guys that are like knowledge experts have been doing it so long that, I feel like I'm trying to learn my ABCs and they're teaching like college physics. So it's really intimidating. There's a lot of information at once. I think dissecting it kind of like slowly and methodically, that's what I've been trying to do. So when you kind of approached me to talk about this, it really resonated with me because there's a lot to wade through. And, like you said, whether you're starting like I am, or even whether you're like several years into it and just kind of retaking a pulse on things is really smart. So obviously, like, we're approaching it more from a hunting perspective. Because that's like one of the first things is just like, what do you want to do? What are your goals? Yeah. Or the way you define it is like vision, which I actually like a lot more. What's your vision for the property?
Yeah, and so if you stay to the end, we got something to give away, which is a guide that'll help people go through it. But that's what we're going to talk about. So I think there's 4 key questions. So the first one is just being honest about what your vision for the property is. So, for example, you mentioned, hey, it's family property, right? We want to use it for recreation. We want to do stuff on it, whatever that might be, 4-wheeling, camping, small game hunting, whatever, right? If there's fishing opportunities maybe on a property, all this stuff that you can do on a property, and we want to deer hunt, right? You have to be honest about your vision for the future of the property, because the other end of the spectrum is a property that is just for big buck hunting, and you are setting it up specifically to harbor big bucks. And I'll just say real honestly that those two things are not the same thing, and you can't have both of those at once. I think a lot of people go wrong when they think they can have everything in one property, and you just can't. If you're going to use it for recreation, you're probably going to have decent hunting at best, and you can set it up for that and have decent hunting and take decent deer. But if you want like the biggest of biggest bucks in your area, you probably can't use it as a recreational property all the time. You just got to be real honest about your vision for it and actually getting that. That's one thing. And also looking at realistically, the deer herd in your area, right? So let's just say you want to take big bucks. You want to set it up for that. Let's just kind of go with that for a second here. You have to look at that realistically too. So let's say your vision is for that. You want to take the top, let's say 10% of deer in your area. Do you even know what that is the first question. And this is where people have an advantage if you've owned the property for a while, right? You kind of maybe have the pulse of what a good buck is in your area. And let me back up for a second, though, because also in vision would be there's a couple ways to look at property. Like there's a group of people out there, and we have someone on the podcast this year I'm going to talk to who's a land guy. He sells land, and his vision and how he sets it up and works with people is for flipping. It's an investment strategy. They're flipping properties every 3 to 5 years, just like you would homes or something. That's a wholly different approach than if, hey, I want to keep this for decades and keep it in the family and all that. Those are totally different things that you got to figure out up front.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I like how you framed it in the lens of like a lot of what you've talked about on your podcast is, and I'm sure a lot of the, listeners or viewers, we love to hunt. And even though your goal might not be, killing a 160 or having a number on it, it's like as hunters, we tend to progress toward like, I want to kill the best deer in my area. Doing more recreational is you are working against that goal. So there is certainly some conflicting, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. With our 40 acres, I know that I'm going to be sacrificing, every time I bring my ATV out there,
the kids,
I'm going to be working against, if I had a specific like buck goal or, either consistently targeting more mature deer or just the most mature deer in the area. So it's okay. You got to be realistic, because if you're not, you're going to set yourself up for failure. Right.
Yeah. It's like pipe dreams equal broken dreams type thing. Right. So you got to be very honest about it. Being
practical and realistic goes a long way in terms of starting, what I've realized of like starting to approach land management.
Yeah. And so another thing, so a lot of guys get into, the size of buck, right? So let's just talk about that for a second. I haven't even talked about goals yet. A lot of people make that a goal. I'd say that's a vision. What's your vision for the deer, the ideal deer you want to take? And I think you can get an idea of the property, given some time and history of what does that look like in your area? So what are your trail cameras showing? What are you seeing? What are the neighbors seeing? What do the neighbors get? What do you get as far as harvesting? What does that top 10% look like? That's probably the peak of where you are right now. You kind of already probably know that. So if, let's say you got 20 bucks, just as a number, that you're seeing, you have on camera and stuff, that'd be like the top 2 or 3 of those bucks. What are they? What are the age class? What are they in score, if you can find that out? Once you figure that out, so let's just, again, assume something. Let's say that is a 3.5-year-old deer, and I'm going to give a couple numbers here. Let's say it's 110-inch would be one example, and then we'll look at a 130-inch. Let's say that's your average score for a 3.5-year-old. Just from science alone, we kind of know how deer progress and how much they grow by year. So this is off scientific studies. I'll find it and link it in the notes. But at 3.5 years, for example, bucks have about 80% of their growth. So if you just extrapolate that and say, okay, we're just going to have a vision of letting them get a year older. That's a realistic thing we can do. We're going to let them get 4.5 before we shoot these deer. And again, be honest about your neighbors and working with them to achieve that, right? But if you do that, that is about 90% of their potential, which is a 124-inch deer. That is your realistic vision of your property. If your 3.5 was 130-inch, you extrapolate that to 90% at 4.5, that's about a 138-inch deer. That's what you could expect. If you're expecting a 200-inch deer and that's your reality, again, that's probably not what you can, I mean, it could happen, but that's not realistic, right?
Right. And doing a small, like, trail cam survey almost is a very realistic thing that most people could do. It's just...
Right.
You got to do it kind of methodically. You got to try and have some like data with it but that's very much within reach for the average guy with a couple cameras.
Right. And then if you go to letting one go 5 or more years where they're pretty much reached their potential, that's getting to 146 inches, I think. I did the math here. And then at the 130 inch, it would be like around 163 inches, right? So it just depends on your area, and that depends on hunting pressure in your area. It depends on genetics. There are just certain areas that don't have the genetics for that growth, and also nutrition. And you can affect some of those, but you can't affect everything, right? So it's just being honest about that up front when you're trying to set your vision for your property. So yeah, you can improve it. What's in the realm of reality? So that's the first question. Like, what is your vision for the property, and does it jive with what is actually there?
It's realistic and possible.
Yeah. And jump in anytime, Mark. But the second thing, so if we keep going with this, what most people, so I'll just kind of go with that, talk about is, okay, the quality of bucks, right? And again, theme, the best whitetails in my area, right? Like, what are the top bucks? Can I be consistent on the top bucks in my area? Once you kind of figured out what those are, the next question is, like, do you even know what these deer need, right? It's just knowing that stuff. And it really boils down to about 4 things. Do you have isolated cover, like really isolated cover where these deer will feel safe? Once deer get of a certain age, they just don't tolerate stuff. So do you have that, or do you even, the knowledge of that? Isolated food, if you can. They maybe in the summer, they're out in these open fields. Once fall hits, they're using isolated food sources as much as possible. They just aren't going to expose themselves, maybe in the rut, but that's what they need, right? Do you have does and breeding? They need that. If these things are not in your property, they'll go find them, right? And then one of the biggest ones, all these things, and lack of hunting pressure. Bucks cannot feel, and we're not talking about young dumb bucks. We're talking about mature bucks. They cannot feel in any way that they're being hunted, or immediately they're gonna be gone, right? So those are the things you need to first know, okay, this is what I need to get. And then you ask the question, do I have it? And this is where it comes into evaluating that and trying to figure that out for your property. Okay, so here is your high IQ moment. When talking about goals, I try to think of these as actions you can clearly take that lead to your vision coming to fruition. Many people set goals around size of deer, which in a sense keeps things out of your control and hard to measure. So I suggest setting your vision for your property and also criteria for deer you will shoot, and then setting action-based goals that will lead toward fulfilling the vision naturally. So I suggest setting your vision for your property and also criteria for deer you will shoot, and then setting action-based goals that will lead toward fulfilling your vision naturally. For example, a vision of having property that holds and produces opportunities at 4.5-year-old or older deer each year would naturally come to fruition with the goals of creating specific buck bedding cover in specific areas of your property and only hunting certain days under certain conditions in these areas. These are specific and measurable and produce good outcomes that bring your vision into reality. Something to think about as you make a high IQ plan for your land. And do you know your deer IQ? Do you think you're deer smart? Why don't you take our new and enhanced Deer IQ test and find out? Different than our fun test last year, this is an in-depth, comprehensive assessment that reveals your strengths, weaknesses, and exactly where you need to focus to become a much better hunter. It's the only tool out there that can tell you this vital information and is specifically made for those serious about improving their deer hunting. Check that out, link below, and join the growing group of hunters who have already seen the big benefit of finding out their true deer IQ. All right, and now let's get back to the podcast. I guess we'll go back to you here. So on your property, where are you kind of at, I guess, in this process of trying to figure all this out?
Man, that's it's hard to answer because literally for the past month, probably at least half of my free mental capacity has been, reading, listening to podcasts on this, watching videos, really just information gathering. Like I said, I'm just trying to learn my ABCs to, you don't know what you don't know. Right. So I just got to start to learn some of this stuff and then kind of sort it out. So I'd say I'm really like in the sorting and planning process of, it's easy to hyperanalyze your property. And again, this is 40 acres. So it's not nothing, but compared to like a deer habitat, that's not a lot. And it's in a area of like several hundred connected acres of timber. So there's not much to analyze on R40. It's old growth timber, man. So there's like very little bedding. We are in a great spot as far as movement. So we get a lot of pass through movement, but it's random. It's undirected. I don't really think that bucks like to hang out there. It's not like hunting's not great, which is, there's a pretty low bar right now.
Right.
So, the good thing is there's a lot of general principles, even though I don't know maybe a lot about, specific timber management or tree species or, all my, low growth plants and shrubs at deer harvest. There's some really general things, like you said. Deer need certain, they need food, they need safety, they need cover, and they need to, other deer, and a lack of pressure. The one thing that I'll probably say I've started to move toward that I think is really, really important, and I'm sure you're probably kind of working into that, is it's really important to look at a greater landscape. Because a deer on my property is not just staying on my property. It's going on the neighbor's. So trying to analyze my neighbor's property and even the section over, because deer are going to be moving through there. So, I don't have any water, but their pond, literally every single neighbor in that whole section has a pond. So it's I don't really need it because it's very available. There doesn't seem to be a lot of great cover. So that's one thing that I'm hoping to improve upon. The best thing is just starting to sort out this information and kind of ask, do you have it or what does it mean to me? We know what deer have. You don't always have to be everything to every deer. One helpful thing I've kind of come across and heard people say is, are there any limiting factors? If there was no water in the area, that's probably one of the better things I could do is dig a pond and provide that limiting resource. So analyzing your property in the context of everything that's around can be pretty helpful. And that's kind of where I'm at right now as far as, what specific changes do I think will have the most impact?
So you said you're just kind of like a pass-through property, right? So you're lacking kind of cover. So in this case,
we're like the parking lot of just
they're running through
openness, and they're, they're going between stuff, but
right.
There's not a lot of, direction.
Yeah, and so I mean that I would say it leaves a lot of opportunity for improvement, right? And so I guess the thing to drive home is that the more of these things you can have, or the less reason you give deer to be somewhere else, the more
absolutely.
opportunity you're going to have. Because on 40 acres, you're right. You have to make that, I would say your goal should be to make that the home, like the core area of a certain amount of bucks, right? And also from studies, you can look up, the GPS collar studies. I think it's 600 to 800 acres is the average range of a buck in, these studies. Again, it could be different out west if they're really roaming to find does during the rut, but we're just talking the normal range of a deer, 600 to 800 acres. Even if you had 600 to 800 acres, what's the chances that would encompass one deer's, like that's their only place they're at? They're going to overlap properties like crazy. So if you have 40 acres, how much of the time can you get them to spend on your property, right? And the more of these things you have, the more that is stacked in your favor. And that's what you're trying to do, right? So if it's wide open like that, that's a huge starting point that you can do. But yeah, this is something for any guy to just be honest and be yeah, do I have these things? How can I enhance these things? And we're not even getting specific. We're just these are just questions to ask. You start answering as you get into this process. And you can go from there, right? And, this is dependent on resources you have too, right? So can you pick the big ones, the ones that make the biggest impact, put your focus on those, and then this isn't going to happen instantly. I think a lot of people think they're going to get instant change, and you can get results. There's some things that are very quick that you can do like that and create some things. Some things will take more time, and it might be dependent on just your resources to tackle some of the stuff, but you can identify them. That's the part, right? That's part of it at the beginning. And question 4, how can you get it? How can you take your property and start filling some of these needs, or as many of them as possible, in the easiest way possible? So the goal, I think, should be, again, so that deer make your property their home. How do you do that, right? As much as possible, how do you do that? So, those are the big questions to really go through and think about. I think about, my property is even smaller than that. I have a backyard food plot. I've talked about it before. I've probably got 3 acres max that is deer cover. But I've maximized that as much as I can. I've put as much cover as I can in there, and I'm always trying to improve it to get deer to at least come through there and hang there as much as possible. Because I know as that pressure goes on around it, I need to have a place where they feel comfortable going, right? And so this year, I think I hunted it twice in the late season. I didn't hunt it all season because I didn't have a reason to, but it was set and ready to go if they, if a buck came through, if I had reason to hunt it. And it's setting that stuff in your favor as much as possible. But we can get back to your property. I mean, any other thoughts there with that? That's the 4 questions. They seem real simple, but it's powerful when you start really digging in and thinking about these things and just getting a trajectory. Because if you don't have that figured out at first, you're going to wind up in totally different places dependent on these things and the vision that you have.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things that you just said was maybe one of the most helpful things that I recently realized is this is not anything that I do out there is not one and done. It's to think about it like an evolving landscape that, you're constantly kind of molding and shaping, the never-ending process. So even though the best time to, to maybe start managing this was yesterday or last year. 5 years ago, it's like, okay, what can I do tomorrow? And then how can I build on that? What can I do next year? Everything takes longer. Everything's more expensive, and kind of, again, coming back to grounded in reality of, what can I manage? If I can't do it, then how do I make it happen? Do I need to talk to somebody else? Do I need to hire somebody to accomplish those goals? But, right now, probably the biggest thing that's helpful is just writing things down. Everything that's in my head as far as, vision, communicating, again, like with my parents who are obviously, majorly involved because it's their property.
Right.
That communication is very important because I don't get the final say, right? And that could be applicable to you if you lease, if you, like I said, have other family property, if you're maybe allowed to make some changes on other people's private that you just have permission. Communication and, man, writing things down is just really helpful. I think actually one of the things I like that you do is all your guides and, journaling. And there's something really powerful to just note it down and kind of get it out of your head and organize it, on your laptop, on paper and journal. And that way you can kind of shape it and come up with, a bullet point that you can check off to say, yep, I've done that. Right. We're headed in the right direction. And something to go back to, next year, I hope to look at the goals that I had for this summer, and kind of see how far have we come, what's next, did anything change in that year? Because, again, I expect it to evolve quite a bit.
Yeah. And I will say this too, like these questions isn't even getting to goals, right? I mentioned vision, and the way I look at that is, okay, this is where we want to go and arrive, a destination of sorts. And my goals are going to things I can easily do that'll push me in that direction. And so the vision will kind of fulfill itself if it's realistic and if I put the right goals in place. We didn't even talk about goals. Goals would be things like I'm going to, do some cutting on my property. These are very concrete things that you can do, right? They start pushing you toward that vision of your property. So these are just things to think about. And yeah, you can get this right here, this land management starter kit. We'll link it below, but this is just a free PDF you can download to just get you thinking, give you a checklist of sorts to just start thinking about this stuff and setting that up. Another thing that you can do is, if you do want consultation or help, you can ask for that as well. We do help people with land plans and setting that up, but this is at least a good start for that as well. Last things before we go. Any last thoughts, Mark?
No, not that I can think of, man. There's a lot of information out there. And, but I think at the end of the day, sit down. It's actually helpful to block some of it out in some ways. Because, food plots are sexy. Everybody wants to food plot, but that's not always the right, answer. So there's a lot of distractions too out there. So sit down, develop your thing. It's just a good place to start.
And then you develop a plan, and the plan will be really detailed, and we can maybe talk about that more in the future, but this is the start, and then the plan details it out. How am I going to reach this vision for my property? And that's when you get real meticulous and detailed with it. But check out that free PDF. Check out our services if you have interest in that. And another thing I'll say is for the hunting strategy side is our whitetail workshop this summer. If that is something which is part of a plan, right? A huge part of a plan is just how you hunt a property, because that can make or break you. You can set it up all right, the land side, but how you hunt it is at least half of it. It is super important. So talking about hunting strategies, getting into those, that pyramid of success we talked about, we go deep into that stuff in this summer workshop. Check that out. If you give me a time, if you email me, adam@driq.com, I'll send you a promo code for $100 off if you're one of the first 12. So that's a great one for guys that really, in general, public or private, if you want to really be a more efficient, successful hunter, more consistent hunter, that's going to help you out. So check that out. So thanks, Mark, for joining us once again.
I appreciate it, man. I'm excited to dive into this stuff.
Awesome. Okay, so here are your high IQ takeaways and challenges. Start thinking about goals as very measurable actions you will take and not the size of bucks you want to harvest, which is just your criteria, your measuring stick for pulling the trigger or releasing the arrow. Next week, we continue to look at practical land and food strategies to make your land optimal to consistently taking great whitetail. You won't want to miss that, and I'll see you then.